The Clone Wars were the first major war in centuries in the Star Wars galaxy, but the decades leading up to the Clone Wars had several other smaller conflicts which helped shape the massive galaxy-spanning war. We've recently covered two of the major pre-Clone Wars conflicts, the Andoan Wars and the Stark Hyperspace War, which reflected some of the political, military, and personal backgrounds for some of the leading figures during the Clone Wars. And today we're going to talk about two other conflicts in this period, which influenced or informed the whole clone part of the Clone Wars. These are the Arcanian Revolution and the Yinkori Uprising. The Arcanian Revolution is a conflict which was largely pieced together from different sourcebook mentions rather than in any direct story, but we still do have a decent bit of information on it. Arcania is a planet just north of Coruscant in the Colonies region, whose inhabitants were mostly distinguished from humans by their hands, which had 4 clawed digits, and their pure white eyes and hair. The Arcanians had spent millennia mastering genetic manipulation, much like the Kaminoans, so there were some other differences between Arcanians and other humanoids, and even some differences within Arcanians, so in different populations of Arcanians it's unclear which features arose naturally and which were kind of self-installed. Arcanian genetic manipulation was also paired with cybernetic modifications. Again, like the Kaminoans, they believed themselves to be at the peak of biological development, but unlike the Kaminoans, they had long been directly integrated into galactic society, initially growing rich as a result of their massive diamond mining operations, which allowed them to fund their cybernetic and genetic research. Arcania was historically governed by the Arcanian Dominion, and dominated by corporate interests in the biomedical and biomechanical fields. Because of their mastery over these fields, the Arcanians had long been engaged in meddling with other species. 17,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, they were actually responsible for the creation of the Quirmian species, of whom Master Yariel Poof was a member, by modifying the pre-existing Zecto species. They created a colony of the Quirmians, but quickly abandoned the venture for fear that the Republic would find out and think it wasn't very epic. By 50 BBY, even some within the Arcanians, referred to as Arcanian renegades, believed that other things they were doing to interfere with other species was going too far. Centuries before this point, at about 450 BBY, the Arcanians had begun implanting one of their neighbor species, the Yaka, with cybernetic implants to make them incredibly intelligent. The ethics of this became highly debated in Arcanian society. So to stop this practice, the Renegades built up an army of fully sentient cyborgs called assimilators, because I guess inventing sentient beings from other droid and alien bits to fight wars for you is somehow more ethical than what the Dominion was also doing. Not to be too brave here, but I think both sides were bad. One of these assimilators would actually go on to become a famous bounty hunter called Gorm the Dissolver. The assimilators quickly gave the Renegades the upper hand against the Dominion, who began working on their own clone army to oppose them. The resulting soldiers were called the Accelerated Transgenic Heuristic Abhorrers, or ATHAs. These 4-meter-tall clones mixed Arcanian genes with other species like the Yaka themselves, the Dianoga, and even Rakghouls, making them incredibly dangerous, incredibly intelligent, and they could even regenerate their bodies after most injuries. The introduction of the ATHAs stopped the Renegades' progress, but it mostly turned the war into a brutal nightmare for both sides. With no reasonable end in sight, the Dominion sought the help of the Republic, but if you're having trouble sleeping because there's too much light in your sight, you can consult today's sponsors, Manta Sleep. Today's video is sponsored by Manta Sleep. I have always been terrible at sleeping, but with their infinitely adjustable sleep mask, Manta Sleep is leading the way in their pro-nap movement to a good night's sleep or a good mid-afternoon nap. There are several mask options and accessories, but I personally have the Manta Sound Sleep Mask, which has integrated and adjustable Bluetooth speakers, allowing me to very comfortably listen to music, podcasts, shows, or even a Star Wars audiobook as I fall asleep. To me, that feature is crucial in making sure my brain doesn't start meticulously planning every conversation I might find myself in the next day. On top of being made out of premium materials, the eye cups in the mask can be adjusted to any location to fit any face, including my very pointy one. They're incredibly effective at blacking out any light. I can't see anything right now, which means if I want to fall asleep listening to a book and Dana wants to read, we can each do that and nobody's disturbed. Kazoo seemed to like it as well. You can go to the link in the description below and use checkout code DATAPAD for 10% off your order. Thanks again to Manta Sleep for sponsoring today's video. The Jedi and the Republic Judicials agreed to intervene on the Dominion behalf, joining the fight against the Renegades. Most of the Renegades were executed by the Dominion and the Assimilators were mostly destroyed. The Dominion then sought to destroy their own army of Athas, wiping out all but one, which was made much easier given that they had built in an expiration date. The surviving Atha was the Prime Atha, called Zeta Magnus. His introduction and this expansion of the Arcanian Revolution was actually largely done to reconcile earlier lore about the Clone Wars, with the idea of clone masters attacking the Republic, with what we learned about the Clone Wars during the prequels. I've talked about this a bit more in depth in a different video going over some of the original conceptions of the prequels. Atha Prime, or Zeta Magnus, went on to have his own pretty interesting life, but we'll leave that for another video. And that brings us to the Yinkori conflict in the nearby Yinkor system. Yinkor, despite being close to the galactic core, was not mapped until about 500 BBY, around the time that the Arcanians were first experimenting with the Akka. They were a pre-spaceflight civilization, but by the decades before the Clone Wars they had made official contact with the Republic, and they were petitioning for membership in the Senate, which they were granted in 58 BBY, in no small part due to the intervention of Darth Plagueis and his public persona, the influential Mun banker Higo Damask. After the Yinkor had achieved spaceflight, they quickly also colonized two other planets in their home system. These were Yithith, a planet covered in shallow seas, and Yibikoror, a planet in a dense atmosphere where the Yinkori set up floating cities held up by balloons. In exchange for his help in gaining Senate representation, the Council of Elders on Yinkor sent Damask a member of their own species to experiment on, as their immunity to Force suggestion had intrigued the secret Sith Lord. On top of that, the reptilian species were considered natural warriors, with thick hide and a strong attachment to the philosophy of might makes right. Plagueis had further developed a relationship with the Kaminoans, and was in search of a species to provide a template for a clone army. At first, the Yinkori seemed like they would be the answer to his needs, but the Kaminoans were skeptical. In their opinion, the Yinkori were too resistant to proper levels of obedience needed to make a suitably compliant army, and this was borne out by repeated failed experiments. Plagueis moved on in his hunt for a clone template over the next 20 years, but his apprentice Darth Sidious maintained an interest in the species. While the Yinkori may not have been suitable for a clone army, Sidious believed their capacity for war could prove a threat to his plans to rule the galaxy for the Sith. The Yinkori were intrigued by the advanced technology to be found in the galaxy, and they quickly built up a collection of advanced weaponry, ships, and other forms of particularly military tech. In this growth and the latest expansionist desire of the Yinkori Council, Sidious saw an opportunity to both eliminate them and weaken the Jedi. With the help of a Deveronian intermediary named Vilmar Grark, Sidious convinced the Yinkori to begin expanding in 33 BBY, the year before the Naboo crisis. This, according to the novel Darth Plagueis, was the first time Sidious's master had sanctioned him getting involved in galactic affairs directly in his Sith persona, although he did go by the moniker Bobo as part of this, so maybe it wasn't entirely his Sith persona. Either way, the Golden Nist shipyards, also found in the Yinkori sector, were first raided in order to provide more ships for their fleet as well as other material. From there, the Yinkori expanded into neighboring sectors, first targeting the moon Mavich 7, an Amalian colony in the Chalinor system. One of the Amalians present defending the planet was able to make a distress call to the Jedi Council, informing them of the surprise attack by the Yinkori. On Chancellor Valorum's request, Master Windu, without needing to consult the rest of the Council, sent a Jedi named Nashon and her Padawan Ebor Talk to investigate. This went unappreciated by the Yinkori, who, on top of their ability to resist mind tricks, had been provided by Sidious with shields made out of cortosis ore, a material which shorted out lightsabers on contact. The Jedi pair stood no chance, and their bodies were sent by the Yinkori back to Coruscant. This spurred the Jedi into more organized action. 3 consular ships were dispatched by the Jedi to the Yinkor system. One, headed for Yinkor itself, carried Mace Windu, Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and was piloted by Saesee Tiin. The second had Adi Gallia flying, as well as Eeth Koth, Sweet Choi, and Theen Fida, which was sent to Yithith. The final one, piloted by Plo Koon, was sent to Yib Koror, and also carried the Lit-Tusis, her Padawan Kakruk, and a Jedi Council member named Micah Giet. Each of these ships was intended to search for the command center of the Yinkori on their assigned world, and then converge whenever it was discovered. The ships were immediately attacked by Yinkori fighters upon their arrival, though. Tin made a highly difficult maneuver wherein he jumped to hyperspace towards and then past the planet, before managing to secretly land on their target. The Yithith-bound cruiser managed to evade fire and confuse the fighters into destroying each other. The final ship, headed for Yibikoror, was nearly destroyed by incoming fire. They managed to escape by jettisoning all escape pods, tricking the Yinkori into following and destroying those rather than the now crash-landing vessel. Meanwhile, with the support of the Sith and Grark, the Yinkhori were launching a mission of their own. A Yinkhori task force was sent to Coruscant itself and infiltrated the Jedi Temple, killing Jedi Knight Jude Rosas, who stood guard, before they began a search for the other Jedi, prioritizing finding younglings. They were unable to find any until they entered one chamber in which Yoda had stationed a large force of Jedi. Luckily, none of them had any explosives or something, as the Jedi were able to eliminate all the invading soldiers while only losing one more Jedi, Tyran Nitan. One of the Yinkhori soldiers was kept alive to interrogate, as Yoda believed the Yinkhori were not acting of their own accord. The captive was unable to divulge the inspiration behind their attack, as none of the Yinkhori actually knew who their true benefactors were in the first place. The teams on Yibik and Yathith quickly wrapped up their searches, unable to find any evidence of the command center, and made their way to Yinkor aboard the consular piloted by Gallia, who had rescued the stranded Yibik team. On Yinkor, the Jedi party had managed to remain mostly undetected, but when Qui-Gon discovered a military staging area, they heard a distinctive sound of their own ship being discovered and destroyed. The rest of the Jedi arrived on the remaining consular and successfully extracted Windu's team, which had been pinned down by Yinkhori soldiers and tanks. Unfortunately, though, the casualties were starting to mount for the Jedi. Lilith Tusis was killed while defending her Padawan Kakruk, who would go on to be a Jedi Master in Luke's order. Thien Fida and Micah Giet were also mortally wounded. Giet managed to survive his initial wounds, though, and was able to detonate a fuel cell, killing himself along with many of the remaining Yinkhori warriors to cover for the rest of the Jedi's escape. It seemed as though the Yinkhori were on the verge of driving the Jedi out of the system and continuing their local conquests, but two major developments began to turn against them. First, the Jedi team on Yinkor was able to locate the Yinkhori command center on a fourth, seemingly uninhabited world called Uhanii. In the Jedi Temple, Yaddle had independently managed to determine that Uhanii meant within world while consulting the holocron of Master Theron's Woe, who had researched the Yinkhori in centuries past and learned of this fourth planet. Secondly, Chancellor Valorum had called in every political favor he could to put together support in the Senate to blockade and embargo the system, organizing a paramilitary to enforce this against strong objections from many in the Senate. Palpatine noted the irony of Valorum's political career having been made by opposing Tarkin's militarist faction this Dark Hyperspace War, but then sanctioning that exact sort of action in this situation. As the Jedi returned to orbit, they were confronted by the massed Yinkhori fleet, but before the Yinkhori could destroy the last Jedi ship, the Judicial Fleet arrived. The Jedi were granted an escort as they approached Uhanii, and after a really bad landing, they forced the Yinkhori in the command center to surrender. This ended the conflict exactly how Sidious had hoped. The Yinkhori were removed as a threat, but the Jedi Order had lost several members, including a Jedi Council member, and the increasing involvement of Jedi in these kinds of situations was beginning to turn some political sentiment against them. While neither of these conflicts turned out to give the Sith the clones they wanted, both in some ways tied into the development of a clone army, for in-universe reasons with the Yinkhori, or out-of-universe reasons in the Arcanian case, tying the original ideas of the Clone Masters into the new lore of the prequel era. Either way, that's going to do it for today's video. Thanks once again to our sponsors, Mantis Sleep. You can check out the link in the description and use the checkout code DATAPAD for 10% off your order. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.